Imagine being trapped inside a tank, steel walls rattling from enemy fire. The air is hot, choking with smoke. Ammunition stacked at your feet begins to cook off, one round after another, turning the vehicle into a furnace. For much of World War II, this was the terrifying fate of many American tank crews. The German army had a name for the American Sherman tank, say Tommy Cooker-Set or Thicher Ronson, Thicher like the lighter, one shot, and they burned. We lost Ed yesterday. The shell hit near the turret. The tank caught fire in seconds. There was no time, no chance to pull him out. But then something changed. By late 1944, German tank crews faced a mystery. Their shells still hit. Their shots still penetrated. Yet more and more Shermans refused to ignite. Crews that once died screaming in fire were now climbing out alive. What the Germans did not know was that America had quietly re-engineered its tanks with a revolutionary safety system, an innovation called Wet-Stowage. Tonight, we tell the story of how a simple, almost invisible change inside the Sherman tank altered the fate of thousands of men and baffled German commanders who never understood why their enemy-sipped steel coffins had suddenly stopped burning. It begins on the battlefields of Normandy, where fire was the most feared killer of all. When America entered the Second World War in 1941, speed was everything. The United States had to arm not only itself, but also supply its allies across multiple continents. The M4 Sherman became the centerpiece of that effort. It was not the biggest tank, nor the heaviest, nor the most powerful. But it could be built in staggering numbers, 50,000 by war's end. The Germans had their Tigers and Panthers, massive, heavily armored machines that inspired fear and respect. In contrast, the Sherman was smaller, lighter, and most dangerously vulnerable to fire. Its ammunition was stored high inside the fighting compartment, often without sufficient protection. When an enemy round penetrated the armor, it could ignite the propellant charges stacked inside like kindling. To German gunners, this weakness became an open secret. Across the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and the Eastern Front, the Sherman gained an infamous reputation. A single well-placed hit could turn it into an inferno. For American crews, the fear of burning alive often outweighed the fear of the shell itself. When you sear inside, you don't think about the enemy tank gun. You think about fire, the heat, the smoke, and the way it traps you. We pray we still be killed instantly, not roasted like so many others. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for the liberation of France, tank crews demanded answers. Letters reached Washington. Reports poured in from the front. Morale was shaken. Some infantrymen whispered that climbing into a Sherman was a death sentence. American engineers listened. In a quiet but urgent redesign, they reimagined the way ammunition was stored. The answer was deceptively simple. Relocate the shells lower into the hull and surround them with water jackets, metal containers filled with liquid that absorbed heat and smothered sparks. They called it Wet-Stowage. It was a technological leap, not in firepower, but in survival. In testing, the odds of a tank catching fire after being hit dropped from over 60% to under 15%. For crews, it was the difference between life and death. Yet here lay the twist. The Germans never realized it. To them, Shermans suddenly seemed luckier, their crews inexplicably escaping. What they did not know was that a hidden revolution in tank design was quietly rewriting the rules of survival on the battlefield. And it would be in the summer of 1944, in the choking fields of Normandy, that this secret would first be tested in fire. Behind every tank, behind every armored column, were young men, barely out of high school. They were mechanics, farm boys, and factory workers, now entrusted with 50 tons of steel. For them, the Sherman was not an abstract machine. It was a home, a shield, and sometimes a coffin. A tank crew was a family of 5. The driver, the bow gunner, the loader, and the commander. Each role relied on the others. Trust was everything. If one man failed, they all died together. "Ma, I don't know if I'll ever see you again. They tell us the Krauts call our tanks their runs. Thou stud nail iter like the kind Dad used to carry. One strike, and we go up in flames. We try not to think about it, but we do. Inside, space was suffocating. Ammunition shells clanged under their boots. The smell of fuel was constant. Each man knew, deep down, that a single spark could end it all in seconds. German tankers, meanwhile, trusted their armor. They believed American crews were soft, their tanks brittle, their courage questionable. What they didn't see were the bonds inside those Shermans, the whispered prayers, the quiet jokes, the stubborn will to fight on. Stay sharp. If we take a hit, don't freeze. Move. Get the hatches open. Watch each other sap's backs. We still get through this. To these men, the question of survival was more than steel thickness or caliber size. It was about trust. Trust that if the worst came, they might still have a chance to live. And by 1944, unknown even to many crews themselves, that chance had quietly improved. The engineers' secret redesign had turned the Sherman into something different. Yet it would take fire and blood in Normandy to prove it. The men would soon discover whether this Wet-Stowage theft could truly save them, or if it was only another false hope. On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history crashed onto the shores of Normandy. Waves of men and machines pressed inland. For the Sherman crews, the battle ahead would not be won on the beaches, but in the dark, twisting countryside just beyond them. The Norman countryside was a labyrinth. Thick hedgerows, ancient earthen embankments topped with dense brush, carved the land into deadly cages. Tanks could not see more than a few yards ahead. Every corner could conceal a German ambush. The Germans exploited this terrain with brutal skill. Panther and Tiger tanks waited like predators in the undergrowth. Panzerfausts, cheap, shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, were in the hands of countless infantrymen, and everywhere, the dreaded 88mm guns lay in wait, capable of tearing through a Sherman's armor as if it were paper. For many crews, this was the nightmare. A hit, a flash, and then fire. The Germans expected it. They had seen it countless times before. But in Normandy, something began to change. Tanks that should have gone up in flames did not. Ammunition that should have ignited remained silent, submerged in its watery cradle. Crews who once had seconds to live now had precious moments to escape. The Kraut shell punched through the side. We thought it was over, but the rounds didn't blow. Smoke filled the tank, but we got out. I can still see Billy crawling from the hatch. If it weren't sit for that, we thought all be dead. To German gunners it made no sense. Their shots still penetrated. Their enemies still died sometimes. But more and more often, the Shermans that should have become pyres left their crews scrambling across the fields, bloodied but alive. The mystery had begun. And as the fighting dragged on, German frustration grew. Why were these Shermans refusing to burn? But survival came at a terrible cost. For every tank that did not catch fire, others still did. And for the men inside, Normandy was still a crucible of death. Normandy was a slaughterhouse. For every Sherman that survived a hit, others did not. Tank battalions lost machines by the dozen. In the first 6 weeks after D-Day, American armored divisions reported casualty rates so high that some units replaced entire crews 2 or 3 times over. In June and July 1944, the 2nd Armored Division alone lost more than 150 Shermans in combat. Crews called their tanks said death traps. Said Balletta's home carried whispers of despair. Morale teetered on collapse. Get me out. Please get me out. I can forget the sound. Men pounding on the hatch from inside while the fire took them. We tried, God help us, but it was too late. For the German panzer divisions, these moments confirmed what they believed, that the Sherman was inferior, an easy kill. Crews joked that American armor was nothing more than targets to be counted. Yet even in the nightmare, something strange was unfolding. Reports trickled in from crews who should have died, but didn't set. Tanks hit in the side, pierced clean through, yet no fire. Shells left intact, men alive. The accounts grew too numerous to ignore. Tank commander reenactment, gasping. She should have gone up, but she didn't set. Back in Washington, engineers already knew why. Wet-Stowage had changed the odds. But to the men on the front lines, the knowledge came slowly, revealed not by technical briefings, but by survival. Still, the cost was staggering. Thousands of American tankers never lived to see the benefit. For every man saved, another burned. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the Sherman Sepp's reputation as a fair Ronson fete clung stubbornly. And to the Germans, nothing seemed to have changed. They believed they still held the upper hand. But a hidden shift was underway, one that would tilt the scales of survival, and with it, the course of armored warfare in Western Europe. The breaking point had come. Now, the tide was about to turn. By July 1944, the Hedgerow fighting reached a fever pitch. American tanks were still being destroyed, but more and more often, the stories coming back carried a different ending. Crews who once would have died in flames were climbing out alive. "It should have lit us up. Why didn't it blow?" Reports like these multiplied. At first, they seemed like luck. But soon a pattern emerged. Tanks with the new Wet-Stowage racks showed a dramatically reduced chance of fire. Crews started to notice, and with that, something more powerful than steel entered the battlefield. Hope. Confidence began to return. The Sherman was still vulnerable, still outgunned by German armor, but the knowledge, sometimes even the superstition, that their tank might no longer be a rolling funeral pyre, gave crews the will to press forward. Warum brennen sie nicht? Why don't they burn? The Germans never understood. They assumed poor aim, faulty ammunition, or sheer chance. What they did not know was that a quiet revolution in design was robbing them of their deadliest psychological weapon. American commanders, too, began to see the difference. Units equipped with the new Wet-Stowage Shermans suffered lower crew casualties. Morale improved. Soldiers who once dreaded climbing into a tank now dared to believe they had a fighting chance. The Sherman was still no match for a Tiger head-to-head, but now survival was no longer a coin toss. The burning stigma of the third Bronson set was slowly being shaken off. For the men inside, every battle was still hell, but hell no longer meant certain fire. "We got hit again yesterday. I thought that was it, but the rounds didn't cook off. We walked away. Maybe this old tank isn't such a coffin after all." The tide had begun to turn, not with a louder gun or thicker armor, but with a simple innovation that gave men a chance to live. But a chance to live did not mean victory. That would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice in the battles still to come. By late July 1944, the Allies prepared for a decisive breakout from the hedgerows. Operation Cobra would unleash American armor into the open plains of Normandy, where maneuver, not attrition, would decide the battle. The Sherman still lacked the raw power of German heavy tanks, but American doctrine leaned on something different: speed, numbers, and coordination. The tank was never meant to duel Panthers one-on-one. It was meant to overwhelm them, to swarm, to combine firepower with infantry, artillery, and air support. In this doctrine, survival mattered as much as firepower. Wet-Stowage gave crews the confidence to push forward into the fight, knowing they had a chance to escape even when hit. A Sherman knocked out but not burning could mean 5 men lived to fight again another day. "Keep moving. Don't stop. Flank them from the left. We'll draw their fire." With every maneuver, the Americans exploited their advantage in numbers. Where one Sherman fell, 3 more pushed forward. And unlike their German counterparts, American crews could often return to the line even after losing their tank. Tank recovery operations became critical. A Sherman disabled but not burned could be salvaged, repaired, and returned to battle. Wet-Stowage meant more tanks were recoverable, machines and men both given a second life. German tankers found themselves trapped in a cruel paradox. They could kill Shermans, yes, but they could not kill them fast enough. For every tank destroyed, 2 more appeared, and now fewer American crews died screaming in fire. The psychological edge the Germans once enjoyed was fading. Step by step, field by field, the Americans advanced. It was not glamorous, it was not without loss. But the Sherman, reviled by some, underestimated by many, was fulfilling its purpose to keep men fighting, to keep pressure unrelenting, and to carry the war forward. By August, the breakout from Normandy was complete. American armor surged across France in great sweeping arcs. Behind them lay thousands of wrecked Shermans, but also thousands of survivors, alive because of an innovation their enemy never understood. The Germans still called them Ronsons, but the name no longer fit. Something had changed, and deep down, German crews felt it. Yet the true test was still ahead. For every tactical victory, the decisive moment of reversal still loomed on the horizon. The breakout from Normandy unleashed a storm. American armored divisions poured into the French countryside, no longer confined by the hedgerows. It was here in the open fields, towns and highways of France that the Sherman faced its greatest test. In the Falaise pocket, thousands of German troops and vehicles were encircled. Panthers and Tigers tried desperately to hold the line, their guns still deadly. But the Americans and their Shermans came in waves. German crews could not stop them all. For every Sherman destroyed, more pressed in, and unlike before, fewer burned in spectacular fireballs. Crews were surviving, tanks were salvaged, and the offensive never slowed. We hit their lines again and again. The Croats were firing like mad, but we kept coming. We lost tanks, but not all of us died with them anymore. We got back in, over and over, until they broke. For German panzer divisions, the battlefield had changed. Their great cats, panthers and tigers, were still fearsome predators. But predators cannot kill a herd when the herd does not stop moving, when the prey refuses to die as expected. They should be dead. Why are they not dead? What they did not know, what they would never know, was that Wet-Stowage had denied them their cruelest weapon, fire. The psychological certainty of seeing an enemy consumed by flame was gone. In its place stood survivors, shaken, scarred, but alive. By September, the Allies had driven across France. Cities fell, German units shattered. The Sherman, derided, doubted, and feared by its own crews, had carried the war to the very borders of Germany. The price was staggering. Thousands of American tankers never made it home, but thousands more lived because their tanks no longer burned as they once had. In their survival lay the turning point, not of a single battle, but of the armored war in the West. The reversal was complete. The Ronson set had endured its trial by fire, and at last refused to burn. When the smoke cleared over Normandy and France, the ground was littered with steel, burned-out Panthers, shattered Tigers, and row upon row of wrecked Shermans. The cost of the breakout was measured not only in miles gained, but in lives lost. For American tank battalions, casualty rates remained among the highest of any unit type. Even with Wet-Stowage, men still died in their machines. But the difference was undeniable. Survivors who might once have been consumed by fire now lived to fight again. Thousands of families would see their sons return because of a quiet change in design hidden beneath the steel floor of a Sherman. We lost the tank, she sipped gone for good, but we walked away. I can stop thinking, if it had been one of the old ones, we sipped the ashes. I guess we were lucky, maybe more than lucky. For the Germans, the mystery remained unsolved. Reports from the front carried frustration. Why did Shermans no longer ignite as they once had? Why did so many enemy crews escape? The answer never reached them. To the end, they believed the Sherman to be an inferior machine, even as its hidden resilience chipped away at their armored dominance. For the Allies, the benefits stretched beyond survival. Tanks that did not burn could often be repaired and returned to the fight. The Sherman became not only the most numerous Allied tank, but also one of the most recoverable. Its survival rate, in men and in machines, multiplied Allied strength with each passing month. But survival was never guaranteed. Thousands of tankers were buried in Normandy-sept soil, their sacrifice remains etched in stone, names carved into white crosses and stars of David. Wet-Stowage saved many, but not all. For the men who did not make it, the war-sept's cruelty remained absolute. By autumn 1944, the Sherman was no longer dismissed as a death trap. It was the workhorse of victory, imperfect, vulnerable, but relentless. Its crews carried with them scars of fire and smoke, and the knowledge that chance had tilted, at last, in their favor. The aftermath of Normandy proved the truth. The war of machines was also a war of men, and in that war, survival was everything. History often remembers the great clashes of tanks and armies, the roar of engines, the thunder of guns, but sometimes, the true legacy of war lies hidden in the details. A redesigned ammunition rack, a bucket of water sealed beneath the floor, small, almost invisible changes that altered the fate of thousands. The Wet-Stowage system was not a weapon of destruction, but of survival. It gave men a chance to climb out of the fire, to write letters home, to live another day, and in doing so, it reshaped the morale of entire battalions. It was proof that innovation was not only about killing more effectively, but about keeping soldiers alive. For the Germans, the lesson was cruel. Their intelligence never unraveled the secret. Their confidence in fire as a weapon against the Sherman gradually eroded. By the time they realized something had changed, it was too late. The tide had turned. Steel and fire could not outpace numbers, endurance, and the ingenuity hidden within the Sherman's steel belly. Today, those Shermans rest in museums and memorials across the world. Visitors often see them as relics of firepower and battle, but inside, beneath the steel, lies a story of quiet innovation, of engineers who cared not just about victory, but about the men who fought inside their machines. The Wet-Stowage system reminds us of a deeper truth. In war, as in life, survival is the first victory. Behind every invention, every adjustment, lies a choice, whether to treat soldiers as expendable or to give them the best chance at life. It is a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion and ingenuity can leave echoes that last far beyond the battlefield. If this story moved you, remember, history is not just dates and battles, it is human lives. Like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history, and together, let us keep these voices alive.